really basic work to populate this trip fact table, but now I'd actually like to do something more. So I want to calculate each trip distance. So in order to do that, I'm going to actually use an expression evaluator that, again, I created a fragment for to pre-populate. And if we look at the expression I'm using to populate the trip distance, you can see that I'm using the starting and ending coordinates and this distance function, but there is no distance function in SQL. So what's going on there? I've actually defined a UDF in the pipeline. So this is what we call an inline UDF. And this is the distance function that's just calculating a simple Euclidean distance between 2 points. And what's happening is when I run the pipeline, that's getting sent over into Snowflake, and that function's created so that then when the function is called in this pipeline SQL, it runs successfully. So I'm going to actually run that now, and then we can take a look and make sure that our trip distance is calculating accordingly. And then we'll go and take a look at this in Snowflake to see what's happening there. Okay, so if we look at the trip distance here, we can see, look, we've got a calculation of 0.74 miles and a distance of 0.87 miles. So that's great. So now let's go back over into Snowflake and see what's happening there. So here's my Snowflake query history. And if I scroll down here, I'm looking for this create or replace function, which is actually, the code that you just saw in the pipeline settings has been sent over here, and that function has been created for us. So lastly, there's one more thing I'd like to do to this pipeline before I call it quits. And I'd really like to create a summary table for some of my analytics and dashboards to look at where I have the trips data summarized by month. So I'm going to go ahead and add some parts of a pipeline that do just that. So I'm going to add this part to create a pivot table. And I'm going to feed in the data with my calculated trip distance. And we can see that all I'm doing is extracting the month name from the trip start time. And I'm just dropping a few fields that I don't need in my pivot. And in my pivot table, I'm using this really handy setting called auto calculate pivot values. And what that's doing is it's taking this pivot field and it's essentially doing a select distinct to figure out what are the values in this column. And then we're figuring out what those columns should be for you. Because if you're familiar, if you try to do this in SQL, the query that you have to generate looks a lot like this, where you're having to specify each of the column names ahead of time. And with something like months of the year, that might not be a big deal, but some data is always changing. So if your data changes and you have a new column value, you have to go back into the query and actually update that. Whereas this auto calculate pivot values is going to take care of that for you. So if I expand this here and we just look at the preview, this isn't going to be a huge table since we only have 2 records running through, but I think what you'll be able to see is that the new columns are getting created for February and January. And, so we can see that if we had a larger data set, we'd get all the months of the year in here, and we'd be good to go for our analytics.